So, I'm Brenda Russell, and I'm the president of the UIC chapter of SUAA, State University Annuitants Association. And right at the beginning, I'm going to introduce Linda Brookhart, who is the executive director in the statewide office. And would you like to come up and just...
Hi everyone. I just wanted to take a few minutes to say that what the state office is doing. I don't know if everyone realizes, or if you got your emails yesterday that said that we're participating in the Teach Out in Springfield on April the 27th. That's a Thursday. So all of you who can and want, or you have friends that want to come down to Springfield, you can pick up signs in our office. We're right candy corner from the Capitol, 217 East Monroe, that say higher education creates jobs. You can take those signs into the rotunda. You can walk around the Capitol campus. That's going to be part of our message, and we hope as many people that can will come down. I know that there are buses leaving from here. Unfortunately, I don't know the exact location. I have a few magnets left out on the table there that says, as you can see, higher education creates jobs. They are actually magnets that you put on your cars on the back. They're not for your file cabinet where only you can see. I have 2 of them on my car. And so I hope that some of you would like to participate also. And then we have another idea that is a bracelet that says higher education creates jobs. And people will say, well, you can't really read it. Well, I have a lot of these bracelets at home. It just shows that you support, and not bracelets that are this one for higher ed. But you can't really read any of them. Gives people an opportunity to come up to you and say, what are you supporting? So you get to have a conversation. I hope more and more people are becoming aware of what is happening to higher education in the state of Illinois. It's devastating. And one of the things that you could do is write letters. If you need any topics, any subject matter, write legislators, write the newspapers. I know that they don't always print a lot, but maybe if they get enough of them, that they will pay attention. So with that, thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I'm excited to hear from Senator Biss. Thank you.
So I'm going to introduce State Senator Daniel Biss. I'm lucky enough to be in his district, so we've had quite a few conversations, haven't we? The formal introduction was written on everything. I didn't bring the list of all the things you do and have done. I know it's unusual for politicians to have a PhD and to understand university life as Daniel does, and that is much appreciated. Things you may not know about him: his brother is a professional pianist. He has 2 small kids and a wife who's a graduate student at Northwestern not for long. In history, and not for long. Graduating soon? Graduating soon. I didn't know that. So Daniel lives about 2 or 3 blocks from where I live in Evanston. So I met him when he was early in his political career, and I think over the time we've got to know each other. And one of the things you're supposed to do, people, is know your state legislators, know the rep, know the senator. That's number 1. You said visit a town hall meeting. Number 2 is be sure they know who you are. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Daniel Biss.
It's very, very kind, and it has been wonderful to have this ongoing relationship, which it varies tremendously from day to day in terms of how much we agree on any given issue, but varies not at all on the basic kind of worldview and mutual respect, and that's the best kind of relationship. That is a comment, and now that I'm in an academic setting, I should say I borrowed it from a friend of mine who's in the mathematics faculty at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and he was able to fit it into a tweet. He said, if you're interested in activism, step 1 is learn who your legislators are. Step 2, call them so often that they learn who you are. And I think there's a lot to that. And yeah, Karen just defended. So Karen will be getting her PhD in history this June, which there's a lot that I can say about that I find incredibly interesting. Maybe it's not why you all are here, but it's an exciting development in our household for sure. Thank you for asking me to come back here. Thank you for being willing to have this conversation about our state situation. Brenda and other organizers just asked me to talk a little bit about the situation the state is in and to really explain my thoughts about where we could be. And I'll do that as quickly as possible because I would love to make time for questions and discussion. But I really want to divide this into 2 halves, which you might characterize as the sad half and the happy half. You wouldn't mind my having done this? Is that okay? Poor Linda and Mike are over there in the corner, and I didn't feel right about the way I was turning my back to them. But I want to start by saying, with a certain level of detail and brutality, what is happening in the state right now. It obviously might feel kind of silly and redundant to come to a public university that is being just absolutely dismantled brick by brick, and think that I can additionally explain what's being done to people across the state as a consequence of the failures in Springfield, but I think it's worth going into in some detail because the comprehensive nature of what's happening is really striking. So we're now kind of getting close-ish to our 22nd month without having a budget. This is not a thing that happens. It's not a thing that's ever happened in Illinois. I can't find an example of another state that's gone through a situation like this. It's particularly unbelievable to me that it's happening in a voluntary context. It's not happening because of an economic crisis that means that the resources aren't there. It's not happening because of a shock to the system or a natural disaster. It's a result of political failure. And so you are likely to have a pretty clear sense of the extent of the devastation to our public universities. Because here we are sitting in one, and I'm sure many of you still have colleagues who are active faculty. I won't get too much into that, but let me just list some other, just literally going to state some statistics here. So there's 22,000 seniors who have lost access to home care, whether it's home-delivered meals or personal care assistance to help them dress and bathe at home. That's just away from the Chicago area. The numbers are larger in the Chicago area itself. So that's about human dignity. That's about being able to age in your neighborhood, in your community, near your family. It's also about, in the long term, saving money by keeping people out of nursing homes. The report on the further downgrade of Northeastern that came out yesterday is just another example. The furlough days that have been happening at Northeastern are particularly extreme, but they're not, I would say, qualitatively unlike what's happening elsewhere in our higher education infrastructure. The devastation on certain community colleges in parts of the state is even more extreme, if you can believe it. And this is felt, and I know this, but I just want to say it out loud because, I don't know, I'm going to say it out loud. This is felt in a way that has behavioral consequences that are not reversible. When faculty at UIC take an offer from a school out of state that they never would have looked at 10 years ago, because, hey, that department may be a less good fit for me, or it may be a less distinguished university, or I may not want to live in that place, but for the love of God, at least it's going to be here in 5 years, that's an irreversible loss of talent for the state of Illinois. When students who are looking at their options after high school are told by their guidance counselors, as guidance counselors are telling students at our hometown high school, Evanston Township High School, don't apply to public institutions in Illinois, it's not safe. And then they go to Iowa, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan. The statistics are very clear. Few of them come back. That is a loss of human capital and talent and vibrancy for the state of Illinois that will last generations. Those are the lucky ones. Because the other set of students who look at the situation of the MAP grant and say, I can't afford to leave the state, but I don't think I can afford to attend any institution of higher education in Illinois anymore, and I'm just not going to do it. That's an extraordinary loss for a person's lifetime. By the way, that's 130,000 people with MAP grants, and a complete uncertainty right now as to which are going to be honored and which aren't, and what consequences that honoring them will have for the institutions that are going to have some kind of enormous bite taken out of their budget. Okay, enough about higher education, you know that stuff. 47,000 children have lost access to childcare. That means 47,000 or more parents, but not that much more than 47,000 because the majority are single mothers, have lost the ability to work while knowing that their children will be safe at home. There has been $0 spent by the state on domestic violence services. 80,000 people have lost access to mental health care. We talk all the time about the spike in opioid addiction. Well, 24,000 people have lost access to substance abuse services. 90% of homeless service providers have laid off staff and or cut programs. 29 rape crisis centers have shut down. And 15,000 young people have lost access to safe places to be after school. So, speaking of that last statistic with the safe places after school, and compound that with the lost social services, whether it's mental health care, whether it's substance abuse treatment, whether it's housing services, and then ask yourself, why again do we have a spike in violence? Are we supposed to be confused about how that came to be? Is that really a coincidence? Of course it's not. Of course it's not. And so the consequences are felt by people who either currently work or have many former colleagues who still work at a public institution in a very kind of day-to-day concrete way. And I just want you to think with me for a second in zooming out about how many different layers of these consequences are being felt by now literally millions of people across the state. And understand, it's again, I say this without hyperbole, knowing the frankly inflammatory nature of what I'm saying. It's a matter of life and death. People are dead today. People are dead today because of the state's failure to have a sane budget. So that's happening, of course, on top of an environment where even though we're not doing all these things the state government is supposed to do, because of the combination of the decrease in the tax rate with the court orders of many of the portions of state spending, we're still running up additional debt. So there's an $11 million addition to the bill backlog on a daily basis. You all are academics, so I'll admit, of course, that's an average. That's not true every day, but some days it's more, some days it's less. And over the course of a quarter, averages to $11 million a day. And the credit rating and the borrowing costs speak for themselves. So this is really bad. I mean, this is really harmful. This is hurting people, it's hurting institutions, it's hurting the vibrancy of the state, it's hurting the reputation of the state, it's making people not want to move here, it's making people want to leave here. The population numbers really are gruesome. Really gruesome. A lot of people like to kind of pretend that's not really true. Oh, it's true. It's true. And again, at some point, the long-term consequences of that become so great that the trend is irreversible. So there's a reason that I stress again and again and again that this is voluntary. And that's because it is easy, in my experience at least, to look at the insanity and the harm and the pain and the damage and frankly the history of government and governance in Illinois and to conclude, listen, it's inevitable. It's just going to be this way. We should think about these problems like we think about the weather, like we think about fiscal problems in Puerto Rico or Greece or Detroit, like we think about the consequences of a terrible, terrible storm. I encounter people on a daily basis who believe that, who don't need to be persuaded of how bad the situation is, but unfortunately do need to be persuaded there's anything that can be done about it. And I don't have any kind of weird trick to explain what can be done about it. I would just recommend that anyone who's confused about this, go outside and pick your favorite form of transport and go a couple miles to the east and walk around and look. And look at the extraordinary affluence that exists in part of this state. And look at the vibrancy of the economy that still exists in parts of this city. And think for a moment about the remarkable and unique assets that we have that have not been removed, that have been perhaps diminished or impaired, but have not been actually taken away. Whether that's the diversity of our economy, the diversity of our population, the population density, which in a modern economy is one of the most extraordinary and important assets there is, and which we have in a way that's unparalleled elsewhere between the coasts. You know the whole drill. We can think for a moment about our metropolitan region's crucial location and the economic benefits that that brings it, whether that's a consequence of transportation networks or natural resources. We have all of these things going for us, and we have extraordinary affluence. We're the 5th largest economy of any state in the country. Now that doesn't mean that we're doing better than you'd expect. We're also the 5th most populous state, but we're doing well. And we are a high wage state in the mean. There is an extraordinary volume of opportunity, and the things that we do wrong are things that we do wrong voluntarily and things that lots and lots and lots and lots of states don't do wrong. And this is the point that I think we need to think carefully about and draw crucial comfort and solace from. You don't need a magic trick. You don't need a revolution. You don't need to look across the globe and find some drastically culturally or politically different place and say we're going to do it like that. We don't need to all of a sudden emulate Singapore's governance structure. We just need to be honest about the fact that there's only 3 or 4 states that have tax systems as dumb as ours. There's only 3 or 4 states that have tax systems as inequitable as ours. So what we do wrong on a tax level is unique. And there's a lot to say about what we do wrong on a tax level, but the simplest thing is that we're one of only 4 states that has a constitutional provision that says you've got to have a flat tax. So I want to dwell on this for a second because I think it's really important in thinking about how we got to this terrible moment. First of all, just who are those 4 states? There's Illinois, worst fiscal condition of any state in the country. There's Pennsylvania, which came in second last year in the race to not have a budget. It took us infinity time to have a budget in fiscal year 16, but it took Pennsylvania about 10 months of the year to do it, maybe 9. So that system isn't working well for them. Then there's Michigan, also famously in tremendous fiscal trouble, and then there's Massachusetts, which is actually quite lovely, but 1 of the 4 is not such a great record. So there's only 4 states that do this, and 3 of them have severe fiscal problems. Let's think for a second about the federal level, where the income tax code is very progressive. It goes from a bottom rate of right around 10% to a top rate of close to 40%. And let's ask, who in Washington wants to change that? Who among thought leaders in federal fiscal policy is trying to enact a flat tax there? Well, first of all, no Democrat, but also not Donald Trump, not Paul Ryan, not Mitch McConnell, not Marco Rubio, not almost any of them. It's basically just Ted Cruz. So here we are in Illinois, we're kind of on Ted Cruz Island by ourselves with a form of fiscal policy that has only been enacted in 4 states in the country, and 3 of those 4 states are suffering as a result. But now, enough of this kind of statistical analysis, let's just look at the facts. Why might I be sad about this? Why might I say that we have a fiscal challenge if we're going to keep this provision in place? Well, when did that provision get there? It got there in 1970. Long story about why, but it's a story for another day. Since 1970, we've had this provision in the tax code, and that provision has said you can have an income tax, but everyone's got to pay the same rate. If you make $20,000, you've got to pay the same rate as if you make $20 million. But what's happened since 1970? Has the economy grown? Let's do a thing. You want to do a thing? So, since 1970, raise your hand if you think the economy's grown. Raise your hand if you think the economy hasn't grown. All right, so we're going to go with the majority rule. The majority's right, the economy's grown. But the growth has not been exactly very equitably distributed. It's been unbelievably concentrated at the very top. Unbelievably concentrated at the very top. So if you're looking at that situation and saying, hey, that's what's happened to the economy, we've had almost 50 years and all the growth going right up there, and you're trying to fund government, you might say that's the fair place to get the money, right? The median household's not doing better, so why should the median household be paying more? The working poor are barely doing better, depending on exactly what metric you use. By some metrics they're doing worse, so why should we ask them to pay more? But the richest residents are doing way better. Not a little better, way, way, way better. So that's where we ought to find the money to fund government to have a working society. Well, that's unconstitutional. Here and 3 other places, nowhere else. So that's why I harp on this. It's a structure embedded in the Constitution that says our tax policy can't follow the reality of the economy. And because our tax policy isn't following the reality of the economy, we've been left behind. And we're dead flat broke, while the middle class pay too much, and we're not funding services properly. Real bad combination. So I'm not saying, as I said, do a magic trick. I'm not saying find an obscure country in a different continent and do what they tried one time. I'm saying just be like the other 46 states. Just don't be one of the 4. But it goes on. We have the worst system of school funding of any state in the country. The worst. The largest percentage of our school dollars comes from property taxes, the largest. As a result, we have the 2nd highest property taxes. We have the greatest inequities between districts that serve affluent families and districts that serve poor families. By the way, if you were to just ask people, hey, what do you think? Imagine 2 school districts, same size, same number of students, but one serves primarily affluent families and one serves primarily families living in poverty. Which one do you think needs more resources if you want them to get to the same place? Everyone says, well, gosh, the affluent families have the ability to supplement what's happening in the school outside of the classroom, and therefore to make up for that inequity, you probably want the district that serves poor families to have more resources. Everyone agrees with that. And that's not a magic trick, that's something that lots of states do. But Illinois, we do the opposite. The districts that serve the communities in the greatest poverty have, in many cases, less than 80% as many resources as as the district serving students, the most affluent communities. So it's really a backward system, and we could fix it by just emulating not one of 2 or 3 great states or someplace across the globe, but literally the majority of states have systems that are much better than ours. But to justify the order in which I laid these principles out, we can't do it with our current tax system. Right now our tax system relies on the assumption we're going to overtax people in their property taxes and have state revenues that are starved because the income tax doesn't work properly. The way to fix that is to fix the Constitution so our income tax can be fixed in a way that brings in revenue but is also fair to middle class families. And then you actually could put in place a normal school funding system like most states have to have equitable and adequate school funding. It's doable. It's doable. And it's not even just things that happen in the most progressive states. Ohio has one of the best systems. Right? We used to live in a world where school funding was just a technical, nonpartisan priority. We all agreed that we would sit down and try to work out a way to do it. That's a world we could live in if we put our minds to it. And then finally, we need to respond to the fact that I laid out about the amount of the new money in the economy that's gone to the top and the lack of economic improvement that middle class families have felt over the course of a couple generations, the lack of improvement that the working poor have felt in their situations for a couple generations. We hear a lot about what you might call relative mobility, which is like, hey, if I'm born to a family in the bottom quartile, what are my odds of landing in the top quartile? How do I move relative to other people in the economy? That's a really interesting and important question. Here's a different interesting and important question. What about absolute mobility? How am I doing today on an absolute basis compared to how my parents were doing at this age? Guess what? Right now, it's the first time in the history of America, at least during the period that we were able to record this and study this, the first time in our history, the majority of people in their 30s, still me for a few months, The majority of people in their 30s are doing on an absolute basis less well economically than their parents were at their age. Think about that one for a second. Think about that one for a second. Think about how that compares to the basic dreams and visions that most people have for their children. So the last set of things that we ought to be doing is enacting policies to create jobs and raise wages for everybody. Not for particular slices, not for particular neighborhoods, not for particular sectors, but for everybody. And there are states that are doing simple but really important work on this. And every time there's a discussion about this, whether it's around minimum wage or sick leave or other protections for workers, particularly low-wage workers, the rejoinder from the other side is, well, it's going to be devastating for employers and it's going to decrease employment and we can't have that. And so I want to end by telling you a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's a state representative in Oregon recently. Because Oregon has enacted a series of these protections, increases in the minimum wage, paid family leave, paid sick leave, retirement savings legislation, a series of mechanisms aimed at working lower middle class and poor workers to lift up their economic opportunity. And they had these fights. Every time they passed one of these bills, there'd be a big fight around what's that going to do for employment? Aren't people going to flee? Aren't businesses going to flee? So at the beginning of this legislative session, I called this friend of mine who's in the Oregon legislature to ask her, hey, what do you guys have planned this session? Because you guys always do cool stuff. I'm curious to know what you have in mind, maybe something I can learn from. And she said, hey, Daniel, all we're working on is housing. Because after what we've done for the last few years, everyone wants to move to Oregon. There's not room for everybody. So there is the ability in a state with this kind of affluence to, in a fair way, find the money to fund government properly. There is the ability to then use that money in an equitable way to invest in every neighborhood so everybody in the state has access to true opportunity. And there's a mechanism to use the force of government to increase wages, grow the middle class, add to people's economic opportunity in a way that is not in conflict with, but is absolutely consistent with the desire to increase population and increase aggregate employment. These are all things that are doable. And they're things that are especially doable in the context of a place like Illinois with its strengths, with its assets, with its resources, and with its extraordinary population. And so I'm not naive. Well, I don't know. I'm not blind to the pain that we're going through as a state. I'm not confused about the devastation that's being wreaked upon Illinois now as a consequence of the failures in Springfield. I'm well aware of what that will mean in the long term if we don't make dramatic changes. But in my thinking about that, I'm buoyed by the knowledge that the dramatic changes we have to make are plausible, they're feasible, they would work, and they can be executed simply by emulating what's happened elsewhere and by saying, let us, for once, not try to look at all the states and figure out, after a careful study, what's the worst possible way to do something. But let us instead truly use the example of the other 49 states as a laboratory to enable us to figure out what can best be done to create opportunity everywhere. So with that, I think it's time, enough about me, it's time for you. Eager to take questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, frustrations, blind rages, anything.
I'm also a constituent, and welcome to UIC. This being a medical campus, I wonder if you could comment on the unending crisis in healthcare financing, both nationally and the state level, and how you think that impacts the future in Illinois.
Yeah, that was a very efficiently phrased question. You asked a question with like 12 words, and now I'm not careful, I'm going to answer it for 12 hours. So a few things. So Medicaid spending on the state level is, on some level, one of the lucky ones, in the sense that the courts have ordered Medicaid spending to more or less continue as they did back in the halcyon days of 2014 when we had an actual budget. That, of course, is a very, very whitewashed way to describe the situation, because the $11 million of additional unpaid bills every day mean that the backlog is getting worse and worse and worse. The backlog is not always evenly distributed, and there are particular providers that have really suffered dramatically as a consequence. And of course, I think it's very important to say that if we're going to be realistic about what is healthcare, healthcare is not Medicaid. Healthcare is a broader set of